Hey everyone, I'm Lee White, and today we're going to be talking about texture. I use it a lot in my work, and I want to show you guys a couple of steps on how I use it, how to control it. A lot of the times I like to teach very easy and simple steps, and so that's what I'm going to do here. I basically use only 3 things to get texture in a lot of my work, and I will show you, and I'm going to show you kind of step by step how I do it, and I'll show you an example. I'll pull this up real quick. This is just a snippet of an illustration that I'm working on for a book, and I'll show you how these techniques have been applied here to this image, but I also have the simple image up first so I can isolate those things and talk about them, make them a little bit easier to understand. But like I said, they are very, very simple techniques, and let's go ahead and dive into it. I like to keep everything simple, by the way. You should strive to keep your techniques and your media simple. These techniques are in Photoshop here today, but you can use Procreate or whatever kind of pixel-based sketch program you are using. These work just fine. They'd probably work in a vector program too, actually. But let's not get sidelined. Okay, so I have this blue square up here just to kind of show you how these textures are working. I can go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and fill the whole screen with that blue texture just to make it easier on myself. All right, there we go. Okay, so overlay texture, I have scanned a piece of watercolor paper. That's all that is, and that's the first step that I do want to recommend is you guys make your own textures. Get out some watercolor paint or some oil paint or acrylic or pencils and just spend a whole day making textures and scanning them. It will be a day very, very well spent. Time is worth it for sure to have your own textures. You can get a lot of them online, but sometimes the resolution is too low and the quality is questionable on a lot of them, and they require just as much work to get them production ready as making your own. So this is just a gray, I just watercolored. I don't think it was gray. I just imported it as a grayscale image, and here it is. It's high resolution and it's just normal. All I'm going to do is set that texture to overlay. It is a very, very simple, very, very easy starting point to get a very, very cool look. I'm going to go ahead and just make a simple horizon line so you can see how it looks when there's 2 colors in here. Whoa, wrong layer. There we go. Okay, so you can see the work that this thing is doing if I move it over to the side. So there's my just basic Photoshop stuff over here, and there's nothing on top of it, and you can see there's my texture doing some work. And that's all step 1 is. Typically I always have something at the top, a texture layer at the top of my layer stack, and that is doing a little bit of work. It's not doing all the work. So some of you guys might say, hey, wait, if I just do this, that looks good enough. There's questionable little areas of this when people just do this one step and they don't do anything else. And one of those areas is things like this. And this is a subtle detail. This is sort of an art nerd detail that will give your technique away. We're trying to hide it and make this look, I always like to try to make my digital process look traditional. Well, when there's a wash, you see this mark that happens to be in the texture. I can move it around. This mark is crossing over the horizon line, and you'd never get that if you're painting something traditionally. There's no way a mark would go from one side of an object to the other because they're painted at different times, right? And so some things start to be problematic when you just use an overlay layer, but it's a fantastic starting point if you've never used texture in your work before, or you have a client that's requesting something really quickly. Sometimes I'll do an overlay technique like this, and I'll ratchet back on it just a little bit when I'm turning in sketches, just to make the sketches have a little bit more of the feel that I want for the final piece. Excuse me. All right, so that's just neither here nor there. We just want to combine these textures. Watch out for using just one thing, because then you want to avoid a gimmicky kind of look or just a gimmick where people can sort of anticipate what it's going to look like. And so that's why I like to combine a few things together and try to hide that. But this is a great one. Sometimes I'll go down in my opacity and I'll add 2 textures here both as overlay textures, and that works pretty well too to start to hide your technique a little bit. One thing I want to mention, let me switch this back to normal, and this is just a normal blend mode here, and it's just at 100%. Your base level value of your texture needs to be 50% gray for the overlay to work. This is sort of confusing, so hang tight here. If you're not well versed in Photoshop, this could sound kind of weird, but basically when you switch your blend mode to overlay, it sees 50% gray as being 50% gray as being transparent. Anything lighter than 50% gray will lighten everything under that layer, our texture layer, and anything darker than 50% will darken all the layers underneath. And so that's important to know. So you want your basic value to be about 50%. You can see when I switch this to overlay, you see how this is just a little bit lighter than this? That makes color selection very, very difficult, because basically what I'm looking to do is I always want to paint freely. And so if say I pick a color, oh, I don't know, let's do that one. And I really want it to be that color. When I go to paint it, oops, wrong layer. When I go to paint it, it's going to show up a little bit lighter. See how when I turn that on and off, it'll be just a little bit lighter. And so what I want to do is just get this to 50%. Here, let me move it over so you can see the edge again. And so I try to basically get it to where you can just barely see it. See if I go down in my value a little bit, get closer, the lighter pixels closer to 50%. Now it's almost invisible. Look at the difference. So hopefully that makes sense. You really do need your base value of the textures you bring in to be 50%. I'll show you a little trick too, just to prove that. I'll make 3 boxes. I'll make one box a light gray. I need to be on that layer. So light gray. I'll make one box dark gray. And I'll make one box 50% gray. If I go to fill, I can say fill with 50% gray. You see how that didn't do anything? It almost looks invisible. You can see the lighter box, you can see the darker box, but you cannot see that one. If I go and switch that layer back to normal, well, there they all are. It's just, it sees this one as being clear because it's 50%. So hopefully that makes sense. I know that it's kind of confusing if people have never seen it before. Okay, so that's our overlay technique. That's the top of our layer stack. If I go over to my demo, my actual painting, you can see there's that layer stack right there. And right now I only have it at 63%. If I turn it on and off, you can see it's not doing a ton of work, but it's doing a little bit. And I have it lightening just a tad. See how my value gets a little bit lighter as I click on that? So it's not much, but it is there, and that's the starting point of most of the stuff that I do. It just kind of gets me going. All right, the next thing is going to be a fill layer, and that is going to be a really, really important layer that does a lot of the work. And a lot of times I want to say, talk about these two together, fill and edges, because they go against each other, or they're contrary to each other, I guess. I like to think of them as the fill is basically I'm trying to think of how to say this best. The fill is how much texture is within an object. And so if I was going to paint let's get a really basic kind of brush. I'll do a hard brush here. I should have worn my glasses. I can't see anything. There we go. Where is a hard edge brush? I cannot see a hard edge brush here. There we go, hard variable line. Sorry about that, I cannot see. Where are my glasses? So if I was gonna make a hard edge brush, you've got the interior, so I'm gonna say I'll make a mountain right here because that's kind of the shape of the rocks that I'm doing. All right, so I've got the interior detail, which is right now just very flat. So I got the interior detail, and then I've got the edge. When you start dealing with texture, those two things are what you're trying to control. Now the problem is, if I use a really, really textured brush, let me grab one real quick, and hopefully I'll do that a little bit easier than I just did my flat brush. Okay, here we go. So Oh my God, that color is crazy. If I want to start painting, I can control. This is really cool for my edges, right? Look at the difference between that first mountain that I painted and this one. Now I've got all kinds of rough textures, and this is a brush that I really, really love to use. The problem is now, you know, as I paint, the texture is not, it's not giving me any kind of new texture on the interior. And a brush like this is really, really focused on the exterior edge. And so I used to fight that a lot when I was starting to use texture, bring it in. I would always fight between whether the interior was like, oh, that's a really cool texture, but then the outside texture didn't look that good, or the outside texture was right, but the interior texture didn't work too well. And so let's just start by filling. I'm going to delete all that stuff. And I'm just going to show you a fill. So I did the same thing, just like this watercolor texture. I scanned a bunch of rolled ink and watercolor and just did all kinds of stuff for, oh, that's why I couldn't find it, because I was looking at my brushes instead of my tools. I scanned a bunch of ink and a bunch of just a ton of stuff, paint and all. I splattered paint. I spent days doing that. And I'll show you one of them here, and I use this one a bunch. So let's go ahead and stamp that in there. All right, so that's all that is right there is just rolled ink. All I did is roll it on a piece of paper, and that's my ink. So say I wanted to make that mountain back here. Again, that's sort of how I would do it. I just start painting in, and I'm only worried about the interior details. Now I'll show you how to control that in just a second. When you're working with fills, sorry, let me go back to my basic brush. When you're working with a fill, you want to lay in a combination of texture. That's going to be what I recommend. So you don't want to just lay in one tone. I typically like to lay in a couple of tones. So I will pick, let's start out with black. I'm going to go to that big ink brush that I made a second ago. The other thing you got to watch out for, so if I make a stamp, and this is all this is, if I stamp too close to that first stamp, it'll start to actually look a little bit blurry. So a lot of times I'll stamp something in there, and then I will rotate the brush. I'll stamp again, and let's just go for like a nice gray tone. Come on. Okay, so you can see I'm starting to layer those textures. Now, I'm not worried about the edges or even the shape of this thing. All I'm trying to do is get a really nice looking interior tone that I like the look of it. And a lot of times I'll use 2 or 3 textures to start to build that up. So I've got this violet that's on top of that black, and that starts to create a little bit of richness. I will then go to another brush that I use quite a bit. This is an inky brush. That's the one I want. And I'll pick another tone even. So let's go ahead and go maybe a little bit off of that tone. You see that? And it starts to add just a little bit of complexity to that texture. So now I've got the black on the inside, and now I've got the violet on top of that, and I've got the this kind of, I don't know, sandy dark color on top of that. So you may be looking at that going, okay, that's great, but how are you supposed to paint with that? A lot of times I will create a mask. So I use a texture layer in combination with a mask. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a mask there. Anything on a mask that's white will show the entire thing, or whatever is white on the mask will show through. And anything that's black, you see my layer stack, will go away. So I've got this. If you hold shift and click on your layer mask, it'll put a big X to it and block it out. So you can see that stuff is still on that layer. It's just being masked out right now. All right, so now I've got a really cool interior texture. That's our texture that we've made. That's our fill. And now we get to control the edges. So now I'll pick a brush. I've already got the fill color. I just need to worry about what the edge is going to look like. And so I will start painting with white. All I'm doing is painting on the mask. I'm just revealing the texture that I just made. So I can absolutely control the texture independently of the edges. Now I'm just worried about getting a really cool edge. There's another added benefit to working like this, and that is if I need to change the shape of whatever I drew later, I don't have to worry about repainting that thing because the texture doesn't match up or the strokes don't match up. Like say I need to make this, instead of a real tall kind of mountain, I need to make it wide. All I'm doing is painting on the mask. And I can absolutely control every single little bit of the edges. I can go make my brush smaller, and if I just toggle between white and black, now I'm erasing into the mask, and I can control my texture infinitely. And that's what I do quite a bit. All I'm doing is painting on different layers on different masks. And so I've got a big old texture underneath, and I got a mask over here that's blocking it, and that tends to work quite well. It's very, very simple again. So I've got an overlay texture doing a little bit of work. You can see how much work this layer is doing with all that texture and stuff. And then on top of that, say I need to, say there's light hitting this. This is a mountain and there's light hitting it. I'll make one more layer, and you start to combine brushes. I guess I could have made a fourth little category there, but I'm not going to mess with that right now. And you start to combine brushes. So I won't, if I've used a really heavily textured brush, I'm going to try to balance that out with something that's not as textured, but still does have a texture. So say I'm going to add a shadow to this. I'll show you what this brush looks like. This is just a watercolor brush, and this comes with Photoshop, so there's nothing special about it. But it's not as textured. You can see it's not as textured as this, but it's also a little more textured than your basic Photoshop thing here. So I'll go on top of my rock, or whatever this is. I wasn't actually even trying to paint anything, just it's a shape right now, but I can add a shadow. And so I'm basically combining a couple of different brushes, couple of different textures, and so these things are all doing just a little bit of work together. This looks crazy hideous right now because I'm not trying to draw anything, but I just want to stress that like the texture, I rarely use just one texture throughout. I try to combine them. A lot of times if I'm going to draw on top of that, which I'll show you in my sample image, I use a rough pencil that I made. So like say maybe this thing's going to have lines going through it or whatever, like a cliff. This texture brush, if I make it bigger, that's what it looks like. And so I'm combining a couple of things, overlay layer on top, texture for the big masses, and then different brushes that fill in the detail. Now let's go over to my sample painting. Here we go, and I'll walk through the layer stack if you guys want to see it. So there's my overlay layer. It's just the watercolor layer on top. I don't know how much to turn off here. Let's go ahead and go down. And you see it looks very familiar, right? It looks almost exactly like what you just saw. If you look over here in the layer stack, these are my rocks. They're under a folder called rocks. And you can see if I turn them off, there's that texture. There's the exact texture that I used for that. There's the front two rocks. So I'm just turning off the masks that are there. If I go down through them. There's that base rock. That's exact demo that I just did. So there's a background. There's some rocks. I a lot of times we'll change the hue as I'm going because I don't know what the color balance is going to be. A little bit of a gradient on this owl that I know I want this owl to be hit with light on the top and go a little bit darker. I'm just going to run through the stack. And this isn't the way that I build the image. A lot of times, as I'm going, I'm adding different layers and stuff at different times. But I'll just show you kind of what's on each layer. And all I'm doing is painting on these masks. It's very, very controllable. This is probably layers from parts of the images that I deleted because I can't show all of it. There's the water. That was made with that real rough brush that I just showed you. This stuff here, that's a brush that I added on top of that. I'll show you kind of what that looks like. It's a really, really rough. And so I've got all these different brushes and I know what they do, and you should have them too. So, getting the overlay texture, that's just step one. And then you got to start to, add nuance. This is just this big gnarly brush. If I paint real hard, you can see kind of what it does, but it's a really rough brush, and I'll just make it really big and barely press down and start to get a little bit of kind of texture on it. So that's what this layer is right there. There's some little swirly lines that are part of my the line drawing that I just showed you. Some trees, that's its own brush too, and I just made a stamp and just easily stamp those things in there. Some collage work, same thing. A little bit of glow, a little bit of clouds. And the rest of the stuff is just regular painting, like in Photoshop, no big tricks or anything like that. But setting up your base values and setting up your textures is a pretty simple thing to do, and you just want to think about big masses, add one layer on top just to get you going, and then think about your fills and your edges separately, and I think it tends to work pretty well. Give it a whirl. Let me know if any of this makes any sense at all in the comments. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Nobody taught me this, so I don't know if you guys are going to be like, what's he talking about? Or that's a dumb way to do it. I don't know. Anyway, I hope it helps you guys out, and I will see you next time.